Hello and welcome to the SciShow Talk Show, that day on SciShow where we talk to cool people about the cool things that they're doing. Right now, we have with us Jeff Good, who works at the University of Montana and is an evolutionary biologist studying domestication of rabbits. So you spend a lot of time with bunnies. That can't be too bad.
Yeah, they're agreeable.
Yeah, are you just sort of over it?
Am I over bunnies?
Or did you not like them to begin with?
Yeah, it's a complicated relationship, but I generally find them pretty interesting.
You find them interesting,
Yeah.
but not so adorable? Because when I think bunnies, I'm like, I want to put it on
Yeah.
my face and go like that. Not so much.
Yeah, that's odd that I haven't done that.
Yeah, you have the opportunity.
I know.
You could be doing it
I
all
have
day.
I have that opportunity.
I'm sure there are many fascinating things about what you're studying right now, but what struck us here at SciShow is rabbits giving us insight into how the domestication of animals happens. Why are rabbits good at this?
Well, so rabbits are really useful for this because they're a relatively recent domestication event. So rabbits were domesticated about 1,400 years ago.
That seems like a pretty long time ago.
Pretty long time ago, but much more recent than a lot of other domestication events like cattle and dogs and chickens and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so rabbits were fairly recent. They were domesticated on the Iberian Peninsula in
Where is that?
southern,
I know science, not geography.
that's fine. So Portugal,
Okay. Yeah.
Spain, and into southern France.
Okay.
And so that sticking out is the Iberian Peninsula. That is where wild rabbits live. And
Well, wild rabbits live all over the place.
so the wild rabbit.
Am I right? Am I wrong about that?
Well, so there are many different species of rabbits.
Yeah.
But the rabbits that basically were domesticated
Right.
are European.
Gave rise to like all of the domesticated rabbits we have
Right.
now, which are tremendously diverse.
Tremendously diverse, yeah, in terms of what they, size, shape, and everything else. So they were, so wild rabbits are from that region of the world. They were domesticated by monks in southern France because they were used as a food source. They were used as a food source there anyway, and they still are, and they're hunted frequently still, and they're managed as like a game species. But monks domesticated them. The lore is that they domesticated them because young rabbits are not considered meat, they were considered fish, so baby rabbits were considered fish. And the rumor was that you could eat them during Lent. Right? So Lent, a lot of hungry monks.
Yeah, it sounds like somebody just really wanted a sandwich during Lent that had some meat on it and just tired of fish. Or there just weren't a lot of fish around. I guess I could see making that compromise. If it wasn't strictly prohibited, it was like, well, all these things we definitely can't have. But no one said anything about baby rabbits.
It's all about the exceptions. So that was, anything that's domesticated, for the most part, we think it's a very tough process to domesticate something.
So this takes
some
time.
things are not amenable to domestication, some things are, and it takes a lot of strong selection. And so actually a lot of what we know about the evolutionary process, and one of the reasons that I'm interested in, probably the primary reason I'm interested in domestication, is because I'm an evolutionary biologist, and domestication tells us a lot about the evolutionary process. So the origin of species started with, the first chapter is all about domestication. Right. Artificial selection is a way to understand the mechanisms of genetics.
Right, and that we can watch it happen much more quickly.
Absolutely.
Because we have a hand in it. So when I think of rabbits, I don't think of something that might be particularly hard to domesticate. To me, like, I would much rather try to domesticate a rabbit than, say, a bull cow, because that seems to me like that might kill me.
Right.
Whereas a rabbit, I feel like if like things go sour, I can just kill this thing with my hands.
That's true. That's true. It's not so much the danger of the domestication process with rabbits, but they're very skittish, and in general, you can think of a rabbit as the Snickers bar of, in this case, Western Europe. Everything eats them. Mortality is all due to predation, so they're generally freaked out a lot. And so,
whenever I get a Snickers bar, it looks terrified.
Yeah,
it's just like, oh God, no, it's finally gonna happen.
You already said what you wanted to do to the rabbit, and like they're scared,
Yeah.
right? So that process of going from a wild animal to domestic requires, among other things, basically removing that fear response.
Right.
And so with rabbits, if you go out and get wild rabbits, and put them in captivity, they usually die.
just of stress.
Yeah, they just they don't do well in captivity, and they go pretty quick.
That makes sense.
Yes.
I imagine that that's not just one gene that codes for being stressed out around humans or, potential prey or potential predators.
Right.
That's probably a very deeply ingrained thing.
Right, and so that was the question that we actually wanted to address with the study, was that, what is it that allows an animal to, what is selected on? What are the key steps? Most of what we know about domestication have to do with the diversity of domestics. So we know a lot about the genetic basis of domestication in dogs, for example, with respect to all the different sizes and shapes of different dogs.
So like how we just sort of changed
Right, how we
size.
change their color and their shape and their size.
But that's not...
And that tends to be simple
Yeah.
genetic changes of large effect, as we would say. So they have simple mutations that have a large effect on phenotype.
So I have a little mutation and suddenly it's a Chihuahua instead of a small
Right.
dog.
So a single mutation, usually a large,
Right.
does something very severe that,
Right.
to create the change. So the question is, what is the genetic basis of that very key early step where you're not talking about selecting on particular traits of domestics, but you're talking about selecting on the ability to be in a domestic situation. And so what we found in this study was it was quite striking. So what we did was we compared populations of wild rabbits that are still alive and running around the Iberian Peninsula, and we compared that with a diversity of different breeds, and we just simply asked what's different between the two. And the answer was not much. And so it turns out that the genetic basis of that step of domestication in rabbits probably had a lot to do with many small genetic changes. And for the most part, those aren't fixed things that are different between all wilds look like this and all domestics look like this, but probably more changes in frequencies of different variants of genes. And collectively, you get the domestic phenotype. So it's quite complicated. And we saw that it was seems to be a lot of genes involved in that are expressed in the brain and probably involved in behavioral responses and neuronal responses. So,
are there other traits that are good for a domestic animal to have? Because it doesn't have to be just like alive in captivity.
Right.
It has to be useful to us.
Right. So the other thing that you might expect to see, so the key of being a domestic is shifting from strongly seasonal breeding scenarios to breeding year-round. And there's definitely... it's the case that domestics will, there's a reason that we have the term, breed like rabbits. They will breed constantly all year round for the most part and have really high production. Whereas in the wild, they have a fixed breeding season, as do most things, and it's much more restricted. And so probably a really strong selective pressure was to basically relax that. And we didn't find direct evidence for that in our study. We know it must be there, but the signal wasn't at least clear from the first pass that we did.
So it's almost like when we domesticate an animal, we're selecting for traits that make them easier to domesticate over time. Because obviously if you can have them breeding more, then you can select for more traits more quickly.
Right. So it does have a bit of a runaway process. As soon as you can breed them more often, you can have more generations, you can select stronger. And so you definitely see that, but this question of pretty much all domestics become non-seasonal breeders, and so it is an interesting pattern, and so there's some follow-up work that a collaborator of mine's doing to try and get at that, and actually doing genetic crosses between, breeding domestics with wilds, which is difficult for all the reasons that I said. It's very hard to keep wild rabbits in captivity. So they're actually doing that, and then looking at the offspring of that, and then also taking those offspring and then breeding them again with domestics and looking at the variation in what you expect to see. Is some are seasonal breeders, some will breed year-round, and things like that. And
so it's definitely not just a behavioral thing. They are incapable of breeding year-round.
It's a mixture of behavior as well as a lot of the seasonal changes are tied into pretty deep-rooted physiological changes that happen in the body. So a lot of seasonal breeders, when they're not in their breeding season, they actually have their reproductive tissues regress totally. And so, their testes
don't have to take care of them.
Are basically, why invest a lot of energy into producing sperm, for example, when you are not going to use it for a while? So that you see that with a lot of strong seasonal breeders. They have a reproductive season. That's when they're doing things like investing energy in reproductive structures. And then when they're not doing that, they're worrying about other things.
Interesting. I had no idea. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that that's not how humans operate. It would be very weird to have our reproductive organs degenerate for several months of the year.
Right. And there would be a busy couple months too, right? It would be, nothing would get
nothing
done.
done.
Nothing would
The
get
world
done.
economy would collapse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Every 8 months.
Yeah.
This is maybe going to be the first time where you're going to know more about the animal than our friend from Animal Wonders, Jessie, is.
Maybe. I don't
'Cause
know.
She's going to bring
She's
us.
good.
She's going to bring us a rabbit, and you seem to know a lot about rabbits. Go God!
This is Cheeks. He's a Netherland dwarf rabbit.
Cheeks.
Oh, show off, bud.
Okay. Well, Jeff, what do you think?
got
Tell
cheeks.
us about Cheeks.
So this is an example of the dwarfs are that we think that at least a lot of the dwarf breeds of rabbits are a single mutation. So this is exactly the opposite of what we talked about, this really complicated process of making a domestic rabbit from a wild rabbit where you have selection on many little things. This is probably one major mutation that has caused it to be, very, very, very small relative to a wild rabbit. And since that trait has been passed along other dwarf breeds and diversified further, but this is the kind of thing that we know quite a bit about in domestication in general. Is what gives us the genetic basis of these very kind of striking phenotypes like this, is traits like this that size or color, which is much, much later after the fact from the original domestication event.
So how big are wild rabbits, and how big do domesticated rabbits get?
So wild rabbits get they're quite a bit bigger than this, but the largest domesticated rabbit is more than twice the size of a wild rabbit. I don't actually know the exact the exact weight range, but some of the domestic breeds are gigantic.
The Flemish Giant
The Flemish
gets over
Giant is
50
huge.
pounds.
50 pounds.
And this is one of the smallest. They get about 500 grams, so it's like 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds. Now, I thought that the Netherland dwarf was the first dwarf that had the mutation.
Okay, so this was the
original. I thought that they bred them.
And then they bred that. They basically passed that because it's a single gene. It's easy to pass around.
And then they did mixed breeds.
Right.
But didn't they take wild? They got small domestic rabbits, and then they bred them with wild rabbits to make them even smaller.
Oh, I don't actually know. See, I didn't know that. With this particular.
Yep. Jesse wins.
Combined.
I feel like Jesse's winning.
No.
This is a competition.
Points by us, though.
Yeah. So the process of breeding back out to wilds is always very difficult. So it's possible sometimes to kind of restock. My understanding is that this particular mutation was, this very, I think it's been isolated to a single gene.
It is,
chromosome 4.
Yeah.
That is basically causes this dwarf phenotype.
Yeah.
And then you can move that around. And there's also similar parallels, for example, in dogs, a lot of the dwarf phenotypes. And sometimes it's the overall size that's small. Sometimes it's shortening
length.
of the limbs. And so you can get, and those are different genetic bases.
Yeah.
Which is, quite a bit more dramatic, but much more simple in a sense than what we think of was domesticated for domestication. Right?
Yeah. These guys, they're still known. You want to hold? All right. So hold him. I know it seems like it'd be easy to hold a rabbit, but you have to really make sure that you support their back. If he struggles and kicks, he can actually dislocate his vertebrae. So put your hands under him and then just support his hips. There you go.
Oh my gosh. They're soft.
So this wouldn't be a mutation that you would select on if you were, breeding them for food, for example.
No.
But
Just cuteness.
Unless it's extra delicious. We don't know.
it's true. Maybe
Some
it's
people might know.
Somebody probably
I
does.
don't know.
maybe these are an exception even as adults to the Lent.
Yeah,
requirement.
because they're tiny.
They're tiny.
So they're basically fish.
They're basically fish. Could be. I don't know.
I mean, you look like a fish to me with the big ears and the fuzzy, giant. Yeah.
Sure, huge teeth.
Yeah.
So most of the selection that you see in domestic breeds of rabbits is quite recent, and it's just on all these traits that we find, curious or bizarre or
Adorable.
Cute or extra soft or
extra
that
soft.
shortened nose, so it makes, but then their eyes stay the same, and so they look like they're little babies. Infants, which humans really find desirable.
Cheeks seems to be very, very domesticated.
Yeah, well, these guys, they
This is
kind of have
licking
a...
me.
He is, he's like, thank you. Do you want some rabbit kisses?
Sure.
Oh, no, don't jump.
It's okay.
There you go. You look so natural with a rabbit in your hands. Are you going to do the face?
Just
put it on your face.
like this.
Yeah.
That is nice. You were onto something earlier, right? Yeah, they're quite amazing. I mean, you think, so, you know, even as an evolutionary biologist, we always come back to Darwin. So Darwin wrote, you know, that you couldn't find anything that was more wild than a wild rabbit and more tame than a tame. He said it in, you know, much more eloquent than I just did. But essentially to that nature, that it's one of the most striking examples of differences in behavior between a wild and a domestic. And you can see that here. If this, well, it wouldn't be pretty if this was wild.
No, it wouldn't. And Hank, you were talking about how you could just, if it went sour, went south or whatever,
Yeah.
you could just kill it. These guys are pretty powerful. Their back legs are pretty darn powerful, and they have the big claws back there. They can do some damage to you.
I believe
You
it.
wouldn't go away unscathed.
Yes, but if I had the choice between a bull and a rabbit,
It's true.
I would go for a wild rabbit over a wild bull.
Just get a red
Yeah.
curtain.
Yeah, that seems like something I would not be successful at. Jeff, thanks for coming on and talking
It's my
about
pleasure.
your work. It sounds really fascinating.
pleasure.
Keep it up. Jesse and Cheeks, thanks for visiting and sharing your cuteness with us. Jesse's YouTube channel is youtube.com/AnimalWondersMontana. There's a link in the description. And maybe we can link to some of your papers or something down there.
Absolutely.
All right.
My website, we study all kinds of things in addition to domestication, so
Awesome.
I'd be happy to do that.
Thanks for watching this episode of The SciShow Doc Show. If you want to keep getting smarter with us, you can go to youtube.com/SciShow and subscribe.